Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video, something a bit different this week in that I'm talking about this, my new novel called Death of the Author in Triplicate. It's published by Corona Zamazat and available directly from there. It's not on Amazon or in bookshops. It's a bit of a sort of guerrilla press for what is a guerrilla book on the nature of reality and justice and all those things. But rather than sort of talk directly about this book or do a reading, I thought I'd do something a bit different. I'm going to do an interview that is in keeping with the structure of the book. So I will have to talk a bit about the book, but the main thing is this is going to be an author interview. So it's a book in 3 parts. The first part is in a sort of police procedural mystery thriller genre, and it stops abruptly and moves into part 2, which is a heated phone argument between 2 people over the rights of an unfinished manuscript. Presumably that was part 1, and the argument is between the literary agent of the author and his widow, and they're basically arguing over the future of the soul of the dead man. Part 3 is of an author character written in the 3rd person, whereas part 1 is 1st person singular and part 2 is 2nd person. Part 3 is 3rd person. An author who has completed his latest novel, which you can probably guess is parts 1 and parts 2, and is tidying away all the stuff, all the sort of notes on the wall and all his pens and everything, as he's ruminating on the next steps for the novel, which is, what's his marketing campaign going to be? What interview questions might he get? Should he preserve the yellow post-it notes as part of a sort of putative literary archive? All these sorts of questions. And he's increasingly sort of getting more and more into the sort of the politics of publishing and all the sort of the messy stuff that you don't see behind the production of a novel that's just sat there on the shelves in a bookshop. And of course there's a 4th author who's missing, hence the title, Death of the Author in Triplicate. That 4th author is me, the hidden moving power behind not only the author in part 3, but of course the whole book. And also I return it back to the 1st person singular, even though I don't appear in the book. Only, of course, any author appears in their book because the book has sprung from their creative imagination. So the nature of the interview that I'm going to do is that the questions and ruminations that the character in part 3 raises, how many of those are directly drawn from my experience and how many have just sprung up from my creative imagination? They've never happened to me, I've just thought about them. And how much is the balance between the two, in that to some extent all writers are like Kaiser Soze, that wonderful character from the film The Usual Suspects, that we're magpies, we make use of anything that we come across. So that is going to be the nature of the interview. It's going to be conducted with the missing author, that is me, but in direct response to the questions raised by the author in the book in section 3. Okay, so here we go. So question 1, do I smoke or vape? I don't. The only time I've ever smoked in my life was when I'd written a play at university, and it was about sort of football hooliganism. It was quite hard to cast because of its subject matter. And in the end I thought, I'll just do it, because if I wasn't prepared to put myself up there and expose myself on stage, I couldn't expect others to do it. And I'd written the part that the guy was smoking. So the director taught me how to smoke, and I in rehearsals I smoked 2 cigarettes a day for the rehearsals, and then 2 on stage during the week-long performance. And we were at a rap party after the run had finished, and I found myself with a glass in hand turning to ask someone for a cigarette, and I was 2 weeks I was addicted, and I managed to sort of snap that off. So I've never really smoked other than that brief 2-week period. 2, do you create lots of notes and put them up on the wall as you write? I don't. I'm what's called a seat of the pantser, so that in sort of writing terms you're either a planner, and you're literally sort of notes on walls, graphs of all sorts of things like character development, or you go by the seat of your pants, that you just you go in with sort of minimal notes and just see where the writing takes you, and that's very much my approach. 3, do you maintain a literary archive? Well, I'm very similar to the character in the book in this, in that writing has changed. I don't mean writing the book, but for example, nobody writes letters anymore. It's all done by email to editors, to publicists, to your agent. So unless you preserve those emails or type them out, a great chunk of what formerly would have constituted an archive is not really in place anymore. And equally, because I'm a seat of the pants and I don't have huge amounts of notes on any writing project, again, there's no sort of way of sort of showing early sort of calculations and thoughts and plot things in note form that you could preserve. So no, I never put anything up on the wall when I write, and I barely make any notes. 4, sorry. Do you have a dedicated study to write in? I don't. This was pre-pandemic, but there is a small study, just sort of converted baby's bedroom in our house, but it's sort of shared between me, my wife, and my 2 student sons. And now that once the pandemic hit and both my wife and I were working from home, it was even less sort of dedicated to any one person. So more often than not, I wrote lying on my bed, and it wasn't a laptop so much as a chest top. I would have, I'd be prone, and the laptop would rest on my chest. 5. Did you write a 33 and a third book, and if so, on who? So if you don't know what this series of books are, basically they're classic albums in all sorts of musical genres, and the series commissions writers to write, basically a monograph on an album that may be about, it can vary quite widely between sort of strictly just looking at the album and its making, or it can be a wider thing, like a couple I've read on hip hop and rap albums. They go into much wider sort of sociological study of the sort of urban scene at the time. But I've never written one, unlike the character in my book who claims to have written one. Part of me wishes that I had, because music is central in my life and as important to me as writing, although I don't make music, never have. But the other part is I'm a fiction writer. I'm not a sort of journalist or researcher type. So I think I would struggle, even though there are plenty of albums that haven't been covered that I would like to do. But I don't think I could. There are those sort of anthology of fiction short stories based on either an artist or an album. So there was one on Joy Division, one on Sonic Youth, one on The Fall, and I'm sure lots of others in music genres that I don't particularly listen to. But I never seem to find out about these things until they're already published, which is somewhat aggravating. But if anyone ever wants to do an anthology of story based on the Ruts, I'm your man. Okay, 6. Do you like easy listening music? Well, the detective in part 1 likes easy listening music as an antidote to all the horror that he sees during the day, and the writer in part 3 is sort of annoyed with himself that he gave him that predilection, because it meant that the writer therefore had to listen to lots of easy listening music, which was not his normal staple. Just so he knew what he was talking about when he was writing. So I don't listen to easy listening music myself. The word easy puts me off. I like music that is not easy listening, that forces you to listen to it, be it musically or the lyrical content, which means I don't really listen to music much when I'm working. Certainly when I'm editing, I never listen to it. I did used to listen. I basically made a playlist for each novel of songs that I felt were relevant to the novel, and I would strictly listen only to that during the writing of the first draft. And my thinking on that was that when you finish writing for the day and then you wake up and you go to work the next day, if you put that playlist on, it will return you straight into the atmosphere and the ambience of your book, of where you left off the night before. I find it's quite useful for that. But this book was slightly different in that I didn't do that. It wasn't until sort of second or third draft that I put a playlist together of songs to do with sort of detectives and things. So things like Elvis Costello Watching the Detectives, Walk On By, both by Dionne Warwick, and the Stranglers cover version, because that song is mentioned as an easy listening classic. Detective Instinct by The Fall, a couple of reggae classics, Murderer by Barrington Levy, and Echo Minot, Murder Weapon. So things like that. But I wasn't doing it for the first draft. I was almost using it like boxers or sports people use music in the dressing room to pump themselves up. I would put this playlist on before I sat down to write, just to, wasn't really to get me back in the ambience of the piece, because I hadn't established that, but just to pump me up really into what in some places is a dark book. 7. Did you listen to The Cure during the writing process for the novel? I ought to say that The Cure, who do feature in the part 3, 2 of their tracks are on this playlist. One is called Object and the other is called So What, from their debut album, which is one of my favourite albums and my favourite album cover of all time as well. But so it was interesting that not only was I not listening to music when I was writing the first draft, but that bit about The Cure that comes into the last part was a very, very late addition to the novel, that it wasn't there for a long, long time. So in that sense, I certainly didn't listen to them, and therefore listening to it didn't factor into the novel. 8. Who was the alcoholic American author you were on a panel with? No such person I have been on a panel with. That was purely a creation of my imagination. 9. Did you in fact start your writing career in playwriting? I did. I started writing plays at university because there was a theatre stage which was free to students to use and make mistakes and learn as they went on. And I only stopped writing plays when my twin boys came along in 1998, and I could no longer hang out at theatre bars because there was a regimen of nappy changing and milk bottles and things like that. So I did, and it was once they started sort of sleeping through the night, I sort of switched from playwriting to novel writing. 10. During your first draft, do you edit as you go along? I don't. For me, the first draft is get it all down, get all the ideas in, and then subsequent drafts are for knocking that into a readable, legible shape. So no, I absolutely don't edit. I also would feel that if I did edit as I go along, it would pull me out of the flow. I was going back to what music does for me, that it gets you back into the ambience and the atmosphere of a piece. But there's also a flow and a momentum. And I feel that if you kept going back on yourself to edit stuff before you established from the beginning to the end what the piece is, I think you'd lose that. 11. Do you keep a file for marketing ideas? I don't until the book's finished. It's always a sign that I'm coming to the end of a book when I start getting ideas for the book, for its marketing, and then I might open a file. But during the writing of the book, I don't. 12. Do you keep a file for writing advice you might give out? I don't keep a file, but I do give out marketing advice, and I have to say that the writer's advice is that it appears in section 3, as the writer answers an email from a wannabe writer now that he's finished his own book. That is all advice that I've given. It's stuff I personally have garnered from being a writer. So it's a bit, I don't keep it in a formal file, I just keep it up here, but it is the stuff that I happen to believe in. 13. Do you really do a draft simply to minimise the amount of adverbs? I don't, but I do a draft where I use the find function to find every instance of ITS and IT''s just to check it's the right one, because as you're writing, you're hearing it, and of course they're homonyms, and you don't necessarily type the right one. So that may seem very bizarre to you, but I do a single draft. It doesn't take very long, where I just keep hitting find and just check that it's the right one. I can also do that for there and there and there. So THEYRE, THERE and THEIR, but that seems to be less of a problem for entering the wrong one. Your and your is another one, actually. YOUR and YOU''RE. That's another one I do a formal draft, just searching for those. 14. The author character says he has written a book unlike any other within its genre. Do you believe that yourself? I don't. I think all writers are in conversation with every piece of literature that's come before. So if you think about genre writers, for example, by definition, they are writing to the prescriptions and the rules, informal as they are, of what that genre allows. And even if the genre writing is looking to subvert those rules, the writers still have to know what the rules are. So absolutely, genre writers are writing in dialogue with what has come before in their chosen genre. But it's not dissimilar in literary fiction either, in that a lot of writers will cite their sources or refer to them even obliquely, buried in the text. And as I say, all fiction writing, I think, is in conversation with all the authors that have gone before them. And in that sense, we are sort of dwarves standing on the shoulders of giants. So the book, I would say, that's most... I mean, all the books I'm about to talk about, I read after I'd done a great chunk of the first draft. So I'm not sure how influential they were. Apart from one, it was a case of someone telling me about this book and me thinking, oh, that sounds like there's overlap with my own. I better check it out to see that my idea hasn't been done before in exactly this fashion. So books that applied to were things like Bedraggling Russian Grandma with Snow by Portuguese writer João Reis. Death of the Author, so it even shares a title with me, by Gilbert Adair. To a lesser extent, The Face on the Cutting Room Floor by Cameron McCabe. So all of these did have some sort of overlapping themes, but were done in very different ways from my own. The book I'd say that was most influential, and I'd read before all of those, so at closer to the start of my own writing, but still not before I'd started this project, was Georges Perec's final novel called 53 Days, which is really a book about him trying to cheat death in the fact of completing this novel before he died. He knew he was dying, he had cancer. And that part one is a detective story. Part two redefines that by totally changing its context. And then part three seems to be a lot of unfinished notes relating to parts one and part two, that are seemingly organised by a couple of his friends, his literary friends. But actually, I think all that is artifice. I think Perec deliberately wrote part three as a sort of fragmentary thing to suggest that death had beaten him, but actually he had cheated death. That this book was complete, although it doesn't look like it is. It's a fantastic book, but there are elements of that, I suppose, in that part one is a detective novel, and then part two completely recontextualises it. I guess there's an echo of my own work in that. Question 15. Is there a yew tree in your garden? Do you even have a garden? Well, we do have a garden. We don't have a yew tree. We have an apple tree. And a source of great aggravation it has been over the years, because the insects get to it long before, they're very edible apples, but they're just, all of them are just destroyed by insects basically. And you spend most of the month of August and September scooping them up off the lawn once they've dropped, so that the rats don't come into the garden. So it's a sort of perpetual Sisyphean labour. And I did once write a flash fiction story about it. 16. Would you really not sell your books for film rights? So the author character sort of says this in part three. He says it in passing, so it's not really sort of elaborated on, unlike a lot of his other views about writing and things. But that one isn't. It's almost sort of by the by. But yeah, I absolutely feel that, because the books I write are internal, or they're formally, they're doing things with form and structure. And films are not very good at internal stuff. They're much better at things like action sequences and things than novels are. but internality, in sort of internal voices and thoughts, they're not nearly as good. And also, if a book is all about the sort of formalist structure as part of the novel, as integral to the novel, again, I don't see how film can come to terms with that. So yeah, I would never want, it would make my life a lot easier because the money's so much better, but I'm not interested in it. I'm interested in the art, as pretentious as that might sound. 17. Are you a Doctor Who fan? This is in reference to an awful expression that the writer uses. There's a thing in authors are told to kill their babies, that no piece of writing is so wonderful that you can't cut it if it doesn't fit with the rest of the text. And the author in part 3 remarks on how Daleks say exterminate, Cybermen say delete, and he goes, authors have to have the same sort of monomania, and their mantra is expurgate. So that's why there's because again, I wanted to show this author, warts and all, that he was a very ordinary guy. He may have highfalutin ideas in part 1 of the novel, but at the end of the day, he has to tidy his desk like the rest of us, and he has to hide his smoking from his wife. He's a very ordinary guy, and again, taking the mystery out of mystery writing, really. So yes, I'm a childhood Doctor Who fan. I came to it by the time of the third Doctor, John Pertwee, and when it was rebooted, whenever that was, with Terence Davis at the helm, it was fantastic, the reboot. And then Terence Davis left because he's a serious playwright. He went to do more serious work, and he was replaced by the current team, and it's just gone down and down and down in my estimation. And I was actually on the point of finally giving up. This is one of the few links to my childhood, this sort of childhood TV program that I've been watching for 40 years or so, or more than 40 years. And I was on the point of giving up and just saying, I'm not going to watch this again, it's so bad, when they appointed a female doctor. And I felt, well, if I give up now, it's going to seem that it was in protest about the Doctor becoming a woman. I couldn't. The optics on that are terrible. So I'm still watching it, and I still feel the scripts that she's given are terrible. So I haven't really changed my mind, but I'm still there. 18. Do you or have you ever seen a psychoanalyst? I don't currently. I have at periods in my life. I don't have a problem with revealing that. The last one I saw was a slightly different type of analyst. He was what's called an existential therapist, whereby you discuss existential fears rather than sort of personal, emotional things of sort of Freudianism and Jungianism and stuff like that. And what it boiled down to me was, as I'm in my sort of coming to my late 50s and thoughts of mortality and things like that, I wanted to explore that through a devoted specialist therapy. And I said, I'm only going to do this for 6 months. That should be enough time to get to grips with it. And it was interesting. It didn't really sort of move me on any, but we had interesting discussions. And actually, although I hadn't gone in with this intention, it helped me decide that I could actually try and write a book about my own death ahead of time, obviously. The writing, that is, not the death. And that will be my next project. I mean, I've written a draft of it, but I need to go back and edit it. That will be my next project. And as I realised this towards the end of my 6 months, and I was discussing it with my therapist, I said to him that, I would happily dedicate it to him, which I have. And I would give him a signed copy, and I would invite him along to any reading or launch party. At which point he sort of said, well, that was a bit difficult for him. There was sort of client confidentiality and conflict of interest and stuff, and he felt that he wouldn't be able to attend, which I found odd, really, especially if I'd finished the therapy. I know you're sort of supposed to maintain the anonymity of the client, but I wouldn't be a client at that point. But anyway, I found that slightly odd. I sort of intellectually understand it, but if I was in his position, I'm not sure I would agree. But yeah, there you go. 19. Do you recycle unused or deleted bits of your work in other pieces, as does the character? I don't. because any bit of writing you do in a draft, which you then subsequently remove, has grown organically out of that piece of work, that novel or short story, whatever it is. You're not going to find, or you shouldn't be looking to find a place for it in another story that's got a completely different feel and atmosphere and ambience to it. So I don't. But one thing I do is, which is a version of what the character does in part 3, is I do maintain a word list of words that I've discovered. I've had to go to the dictionary and look them up, because I'm always looking for greater and greater precision of my language, of my written language. And there are lots of words, particularly sort of Greek and Latin rooted words, maybe from the medical sphere or whatever, that actually are very precise and fit and suit. So I don't maintain a formal file of these words, but I'm aware of, oh yes, I remember that word. Funnily enough, there's a discussion group I've been in for years on Goodreads, where we had one dedicated thread to people just offering up words they'd come across in their reading that they weren't familiar with, and they went and looked up, and we would share them with the group. So that actually is my list of words that I've posted into this group on Goodreads, and occasionally I will go back and look and go, I knew there was a word for that. And I sort of slightly sort of satirise that sort of word list in part 3 of the novel. And finally, do you fake the cleaning out of the bath? I have to say that that applies to the character of the author who wrote part 1 and does not apply to the author who wrote part 3. Therefore, I don't feel beholden to answer this. Okay, so there you have it. I hope that was a bit of fun. And I hope it also gives you a little bit of insight between the tension of the relationship between an author character and the real life author, who may or may not appear in the book in the guise of that author character. Thank you very much.